This will be a summary of the article When and Why Introducing Difficulties and Errors Can Enhance Instruction by Courtney M. Clark and Robert A. Bjork. Here's a basic overview of what this article is about. Historically, there has been a debate over whether errors should be avoided in education or viewed as important. The authors explore the historical debate. They also, one of the big points in the article is that students crave fast and easy learning, but what research actually shows is that harder and not easier methods impact learning. And the authors go on to introduce practical ways that teachers can introduce desirable difficulties, is what they call it, such as spacing, interleaving, and testing to make great gains in learning. The big debate on whether errors should be avoided or viewed as important is a difference between in Skinner in 1958 believed that scaffolded learning was best, and that you want to make sure to avoid learners having to make mistakes, and learning should be easy, and we should protect our children from mistakes. However, research now, Bjork in 1994, discussed the idea of desirable difficulties, increasing actually the frequency of errors. And what was found is that this will often enhance the transfer of learning, and as well as long-term retention. The authors discuss that there are ultimately two dimensions of learning. There is your current performance and underlying learning. Your current performance can show what progress you've made, and but it doesn't really tell us a lot. It doesn't tell us what's lasting, what learning is lasting. So it's not necessarily, it's quite fragile actually. They then discuss the accessibility continuum, which in a sense, we all have information that's easy to restore. And so, for instance, if we lived in California and the question was asked, what is the capital of California? That information is accessible to us. It has a high accessibility. The information is easier for us to restore because we are from California, versus the low accessibility is information that's harder to restore or more difficult. Essentially, there are bigger gains if accessibility is reduced. It's difficult to make further gains in the underlying learning, lasting learning, if we have high accessibility. For instance, if we're looking at a formula right before an assessment, it's not necessarily going to be indicative of lasting learning. We want to be able to create opportunities for new, higher levels of learning. So the bottom line is there are bigger gains in learning if the access is reduced and learning is actually harder. And research shows that if the learning is harder and we reduce the accessibility to it in education, we will have more underlying learning and lasting learning. So how does one create an environment? How does a teacher or educator create an environment for lasting learning? And there are these three key areas to create what the authors call desirable difficulties. It's a way to decrease accessibility and therefore increase learning. And what goes with that is also increase errors. These three ways to create this sort of complex, difficult learning environment that will create a lasting learning environment is spacing, which is essentially distributing practice over time; interleaving, which is mixing up the learning instead of having it in blocks; and testing, which is a learning tool, seen as a learning tool, not an assessment in this frame. and I'll discuss each one here. So spacing is opposed to cramming. So research shows that if one crams before a test, that the long-term retention is not as good as if there was practice and study over a period of time. Now, interleaving is the idea of mixing up the learning. So, for example, assigning a few problems from each section of a book. Most textbooks have blocked conditions where there's specific learning and one concept or skill taught at a time. And those conditions are not as successful for lasting learning. They prove better in practice, but later, in terms of retention, not as successful. Testing is the third area, and what the authors are referring to is using testing as a learning tool instead of an assessment. So what research has shown is that retrieval has direct benefits on learning. So there's, for instance, a study done in 2006 where one group studied something 4 times, and another group studied it 1 time but had 3 recall tests. And 1 week later, the group that only studied it 1 time but had the 3 recall tests, the performance was better. So testing as a learning tool, pre-tests, low stakes quizzes have an impact on lasting learning. The idea of productive failure outperforms direct instruction based on research. So, for instance, providing students with complex problems that they are unable to solve, even if they're making errors, is, in the long run, better for learning than simple direct instruction, scaffolding the learning, making the learning easier. So even though if the students are given a problem that they are unable to solve, but the teacher stops and helps them analyze and provides them with the correct methods, research shows that productive failure outperforms direct instruction in learning retention and lasting learning. Students and teachers often crave what's fast and easy and scaffold the process, make it as easy as possible. But what we do need to realize as educators is that productive failure and desirable difficulty create learning that lasts. So in summary, teachers should revisit the material, space it out, mix it up, interleave. Teachers should use pre-test practice tests and low-stakes quizzes to support retrieval and learning, and provide opportunities for metacognitive thinking and for students to reflect on their learning and decide how much they've learned or if they've learned material or not. One quote from the article is, "However nice it might be to have a magic wand to offer teachers and students, one that can get students to learn a foreign language in 2 weeks or become competent pianists after only a few lessons, what we offer instead are difficulties, but difficulties that promote durable and flexible long-term learning and transfer." So ultimately, although we all desire fast and easy in our culture and climate, it is the complex, it's working through the hard stuff, it's working through the failure, it's making errors, thinking critically about it, that are what learning is all about. Learning essentially should be difficult and error-full. And that's a summary of the article.